All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to week 4 of AirConf. And we have an announcement to make later today. We're going to be extending the talks all the way through September, October, and November. But today I'm pretty excited for one of my favorite AirPair experts and Angular Google developer expert, Uri Shaked, who is a lecturer at the Technion in Israel. University over there, and also an avid salsa dancer. Uri's not going to be talking to us about salsa today. He's going to be sharing with us common pitfalls and performance problems in AngularJS. So with that said, I'm excited to have our audience tuning in from Alabama, Hong Kong, we're in San Francisco, and Uri, please.
Okay, just a moment. I'm just trying to set up the camera even better than I did before. So, nice to meet everybody, and thank you for joining in. We are going to have a quick session about avoiding common mistakes with AngularJS, common pitfalls. Those are things that I have learned during the time that I developed for AngularJS. We are going to see some code samples illustrating those issues that we are going to discuss, and then we'll have time for some questions and answers. So let's dive in. Let me start sharing my screen. Screen sharing. Sharing the screen, yeah. Okay, you can see an infinite loop of the Hangouts, and now you should be able to see my slides. So, as I said before, we're going to talk about how to avoid common pitfalls with AngularJS and not be like this donkey wandering around and trying to figure out why our code doesn't work, or worse, it works, but not as we expected it to. So first thing first, a little bit about what we are going to talk right now. So there are like 4 different demos that we are going to introduce you to. I'm going to introduce you throughout this talk. Each daemon has its own attributes, and they are all like kind of a little naughty. They like to mess around, and if you don't know them very well, they can be very dangerous for your code. So there is Mr. Performance, which affects the speed and the responsiveness of your application. Dr. William Scope, which does some of the magical stuff that Angular do for you, like two-way data bindings. Messy Wendy, which we'll meet later. And DOMinique, which we are going to meet very soon, is the daemon of the DOM. But first thing, Jonathan introduced me, so I will just give some highlights about me. So my name is Uri. I'm a Google Developer Expert for AngularJS. Google Developer Expert is a Google program that recognizes field experts in Google products. And since AngularJS is a Google product, they have AngularJS Google Developer Expert. I did salsa. I also teach a web technology course in the Technion, which is like the Israeli MIT. Work part-time for a startup company called Watchdogs. I really love building hardware stuff and breaking it. I also created a few open source AngularJS modules, so you're invited to check them out, such as the Angular Moment. And I also like to travel a lot. You can see here a picture of me traveling in the Amazonas river, in the Amazon River near Peru. So, going to meet the first daemon. That is DOMinique. DOMinique is going to teach you how to avoid cluttering your code with DOM manipulation and do it the AngularJS way instead. If you're already familiar with Angular, you probably know that jQuery developers are used to just interact with the DOM directly by writing code like $.get and then using the dollar function to locate elements inside the code and update the DOM directly. So with AngularJS, the way to do this is to use views, and then if you need to create some kind of reusable component or add some special kind of behavior, you can use custom directive. But before you go forward and create a custom directive, there are plenty of directives that are already built into AngularJS, and most of the newcomers are not familiar with. So let's take a quick look at those directives. You can see that there are like two types of directives. Many on the left side, you can see many directives that handle events. So you have click, double click, focus, blur. Generally, every standard event of the DOM of the web browser. And then there is also a third-party module called the Angular Touch. So if you target mobile devices, you probably want to check it out. It lets you handle touch event and gestures like swipe, and then it's based on jQuery mobile. And on the right side, you can see many other kind of directives such as ng-class, ng-style, ng-repeat, which either control the presentation, the first ones, and then those ng-repeat, ng-if, ng-switch are more like control flow directives. So you can generally do a lot of things with the built-in directives, but then if you need to include some custom functionality, then the way to go is to write your own directive and not just clutter your controllers with jQuery code. So, as we said, as a quick summary, you can use all the built-in directives to listen for events and update the DOM. You can use the curly braces binding expressions to put stuff into the DOM. And when you need custom behavior, just write a custom directive, or you can wrap an existing jQuery plugin. But then you don't want to interact with the DOM inside your controllers and services for several reasons. First of all, it makes it hard to reason about your code and understand which part of the code updates which part of the page once you start interacting with the DOM from within your controllers. Then there are also performance reasons, which we'll see soon. And it makes the code really hard to test, which we are going to talk about later. So use built-in directives or write your own. Do include your jQuery code inside custom directives. Never touch the DOM or use jQuery within controllers or services. So a quick trick from DOMinique. When you initially load your page, your users are going to see all of the binding expressions, and it's going to look not so pretty. You can add ng-cloak class to your body or your main div, and then Angular will hide all of that content until Angular has initialized and bound all the expressions you have in your HTML file. So all you need to do is just add the CSS rule to hide all the elements that has the ngCloud class, as you can see here. And then in your view, you can add in your template, you can add the class equals ngCloud, and Angular will make sure this part of the screen won't be displayed until Angular is ready and bound all of the expression, the two-way binding expressions. So that's about DOMinique, the DOM daemon. And the next guy we're going to meet, as we promised you before, is Mr. Performance. He will teach you how to avoid writing poorly performing code and make sure that your application will run smoothly. So, what does Mr. Performance has to say to us? First of all, some of us are familiar with the magic behind the two-way data binding, which is called the digest loop. It's like a process in which Angular iterates through all of the bindings that you have in your application and checking for values that has changes. And then it notifies the views and other watchers that some value changed, and then the views or whatever code that wants can update itself based on the new value of the scope member that has just changed. So there are two things to note about this process. First of all, if you use filters in your view, they will be evaluated on every digest loop. And the digest can happen many times. In some cases, it can even happen whenever you move your mouse around the screen. So definitely don't make complicated computations inside the filters, because it will make the digest process really slow, and it will also harder for performance of the application, of course. And the same goes for watch functions. So let's dive into the first code example, and then we'll also see some nice method. Some nice method. Then my mouse stopped working. Let me try to see if I can fix that.
Just before we continue, does anyone have any questions so far?
Yeah, that's a good time for questions.
It's a good time for questions.
Yeah.
Well, I have a bit of a question about, I don't know if it's going off topic too quickly, but what are the different ways that you can load Angular templates? So I guess you could put them directly on the page when the page loads, or you can like make an XHR request to like grab templates as you move around the app. What are the ways that you've seen, and do you have a preference?
So yeah, I mean the usual way.
Yuri, can we see your video for a sec?
Sorry, did you have any other question?
Can we catch
Okay,
up?
so the usual way, Jonathan?
Yeah, can we catch a video for 1 second? We can see your face.
Well, Jonathan, it seems like I ran out of the battery in my wireless mouse. Is it okay if I just go to change it for a moment?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I will be back in.
Demo goods. Demo goods.
Sorry.
So Demo, what are you guys planning to build next on Angular, and what were you using previously?
I think we're building a portal for some of our clients to work for a health insurance company. So we're building a portal for our clients to like request a new health insurance card or like get an explanation of their benefits. Just a portal, basically. We don't have one at all, like zero. So we're just trying to find something cool to build it with and have fun at the same time.
Cool. How did you decide to choose Angular?
We're a really small team. There's only 3 of us, but the other guy has a lot of history in Angular. He tested it.
Alright, I think curious.
Okay, so Jonathan, you had a question before I went about the...
Yeah, I was just saying if we can see your face for a moment while you answer, that'd be cool. Like maybe
sure,
stop
sure.
this from share. And also, I've also got your slides open in the other window. So
So,
if you want, we can tag them.
so the screen sharing. Screen sharing. Okay, can you see my face now?
I can, yeah. It's gorgeous.
Okay, perfect. So, so your question was about improving the performance of loading the templates for the views and the directives. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I
Okay,
guess
so
NG cloak would just like hide with CSS, but it would still be like in your markup on your page, which maybe doesn't matter.
can you repeat the question about the CSS?
So I guess NG cloak, that would just stop it from being visible, but it would still be in your markup, right? Which maybe isn't such a problem. But with a big app, do you have all your markup on the page when it loads?
Well, first of all, the purpose of ngCloak is just to hide like the initial template that has the initial markup before all the views are loaded and so. So if you go, for example, to, I think that mailinator.com, which is a service that gives you like free anonymous mailbox, they are using Angular, and they have this issue where if you go to the website, you will see a quick flash of like all the Angular 2 binding markups for a few moments until they Angular runs and populates all the values from the controllers. But in case of a bigger app, usually either load the templates using XHR or bundle them inside the JavaScript bundle of your application, but they are not loaded and parsed until you actually use them. So if you're using, for example, the Angular router or the UI router, the routing component takes care of loading the appropriate template when you navigate to the specific view. And then it doesn't really matter whether the template is stored inside the JavaScript or inside the HTML, but as unparsed block of HTML. It just gets parsed when the browser actually needs to display it. So in terms of performance, I think that the best way is to bundle all the templates, at least the most common ones, inside the main JavaScript. So you won't have to wait for each view to load the template whenever you navigate to a new view. The templates for the views are usually pretty small, and then they're also getting compressed when they're served over HTTP. In terms of performance, I think that the latency of the round trip of going to the server and getting the new template each time that when you navigate to a new view isn't worth it in comparison to adding a few kilobytes to your compiled, concatenated, and uglified JavaScript file. Does it answer the question?
Yeah, spot on.
Okay, perfect.
Cool. Okay, are we on this slide, or have I gone too far?
So yeah. So we were like on, yeah, that's the correct one, finding slow watches. So let me share my screen again and see how we can find which watches are slowing us down. Okay, can you see my screen again?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm not sure whether everyone here is familiar with Batarang. It's a Chrome extension that lets us see nice things about the models that we have in page, and then it can also help us to find slow watches, what is slowing down our page. So I've prepared a quick demo. So you can install Betterrank from the Chrome App Market, Chrome Web Store. It's like a nice tool for debugging AngularJS. Let's see if I got this open. I have my WebStorm here and a slow watch example. Okay, so I'm going to make my font size a little bigger so you will be able to see it. I think this will be okay. This is better, and then I will start my local web server. That will take a moment. It's a new laptop, so I haven't had a chance to install everything on it yet. So while it's installing, we'll go over the code. So there is a really simple application here, one page. Just for the sake of demo, I put both the view and the controller in the same file. So the view is like doing two things. First of all, it's calculating the Fibonacci number, and then we have ng-mouse move, which will be called whenever we move the mouse over this Fibonacci big deal. And we use this in order to induce a digest cycle. So we can see how the digest cycles are happening as we move the mouse. So, okay, Gulp is ready. Let's run it. And then we'll be able to see it in action. Let's see if I have Betterrank installed. I think I have. No, I don't have. So, quick demo how to install Betterrank. We go to the Chrome Web Store, and then we just add it to Chrome. It's that easy. Let's go to the slow watches page. Okay, so let me make the font bigger and open the slow watches. Why don't I see Betterrank? I guess that I have to reopen the DevTools. Yeah. So as you can see on the DevTools, I now have a new AngularJS tab. That is actually the Betterrank tab. So I just enable it, and then I can go to the Performance tab. And inside the Performance tab, I can see that I have two watch expressions. Right now, they are both like taking 2 milliseconds on the initial page load. Now when I will move my mouse over the Fibonacci big, they will be re-evaluated, and we'll be able to see that over the time, they are calculated so far like 300 times each time I move my mouse. And we can see that Fibonacci big took more than almost 1.5 seconds to calculate, while the Fibonacci small took only 34 milliseconds. So in this case, we can see that this specific watch is causing our page to be probably sluggish or slow, or and it's the heaviest one on the page. So using Betterrank and this Performance tab, we can find out which expressions are slowest to evaluate, and then, for example, we could add some caching to the to this expression to make sure it won't be recalculated for 25 each time. Or another thing we could do is just, instead of calculating it, calling this function from the view, we could just change our controller to say that we have Fibonacci 5, which equals Fibonacci of 5, and Fibonacci 25, which equals the Fibonacci 25. and then just show the content of those variables. So by like it doesn't like something about that. Oh yeah, the function is good. Probably misspelled it. Okay. And I probably misspelled it too, here too as well. Okay. Okay, I misspelled it here. Okay, so if we go back to the Betarang, we'll see that they are no longer taking so much time. Actually, the 5.1 is taking more time right now. I guess it's because this is the first watch on the page, so there is some garbage collection or something like this going on behind the scenes, and that's why it's a little slower. With Angular 1.3, they actually also have another option, which is called one-way binding. So instead of pre-calculating the values in our controller, we can simply do it this way. We can simply add, I think it's double colon before the expression, and then it will be evaluated only once. And whenever it gets a value which is not undefined, it will just be evaluated, and Angular will stop the watch. So starting from Angular 1.3, you will be able to just use the one-way data binding and instead of the do-way. And this way, this is another method you can speed up your slow watches. So, Jonathan, do we want to give another slot for questions before we go back to the slides?
Devin, do you have any questions? Or John or Shane? I think we can keep going.
Okay, perfect. So we have seen how to find slow watches using Betarang and how to use Betarang. And then the other thing that can really slow us down is infinite digest loop. For example, if you look in the following example of using ngRepeat, it looks quite innocent because it looks like we are iterating an array of numbers array that contains two arrays of numbers, and it looks like it's a constant. So when we write this code, we just expect it to show the list of to display those two arrays and their lengths. And as we can see in our next demo, let me close that, it actually works. And it seems to be working and everything is fine. But then if we open the DevTools and look inside the console, we can see we have like some nasty error message about infinite digest, 10 digest iteration reached. What this actually means, this error confuses many newcomers who get it for the first time and don't know what to do with all this information that you get here. What it actually means is that Angular had an infinite loop in the digest cycle. How did that happen? When we created this array, Angular started watching it for changes. But it doesn't watch the actual array, it watches the expression that is used to create this array. And it reevaluates this expression upon every digest cycle. So whenever there is a digest cycle, Angular reevaluates this expression that you can see that I marked in blue, and recreates this array. And then it compares the elements to the elements of the previous array it had in the previous digest cycle. I'm not sure if you are aware of that, but in Angular, in JavaScript, arrays are not equal to one to each other, even if they contain the same elements. So whenever Angular checks the equity of those elements in the previous expression and the new expression, it finds that the array has changed, and it says, okay, something has changed, so I have to rerun the entire ng repeat and recreate all those diffs inside the ng repeat. But then it says, okay, now that I have updated the diffs in the ng repeat, I want to check if there are some more changes that were caused by the last digest. So it calls another digest cycle, and in that digest cycle, the same things happens again. I mean, this expression is evaluated, those two arrays are created, they are not equal to the previous values, and then the cycle is repeated over and over again. And Angular has like a hard-coded limit of 10 digest iterations. So once it gets to the 10th cycle of the digest and figuring out that the values are still coming out different, it will throw this exception, and it will usually show here what function caused the digest cycle, the infinite digest cycle, what function had the values changing in each iteration. It can be useful, but it's like hard to dig in the data from that. For example, you can see that we have the some clue about the actual reason for this infinite digest iteration here in the stack trace. You can actually see the content of the div that was created as a result of watching this expression. But I think it would be kind of tricky to recognize this one. So there are usually infinite digests happen in ng repeat. It's not the only place, because you can just watch return value of some function on the scope, and that function will just return a new object on each invocation, and it will also cause an infinite repeat, an infinite digest cycle. But it usually happens in ng repeat, where you have some list, some array of objects, and those objects are recreated for some reason upon every digest iteration. Usually, bad written filters can also cause that when they're used in conjunction with ng repeat. So whenever you get this infinite digest error, you can, I mean, if you ignore it, it will just make your application 10 times slower, because whenever Angular needs to perform a digest cycle, it will perform 10 ones instead of 1, and it will also put all of this stuff on your console, which can be kind of quite annoying. So whenever you get this one, you probably want to check your ng repeats, and if you're doing some watch on if you have added some watch on a function, then to check whether this function always returns the same value unless something has changed. And then you can also try to look for some clues inside the stack trace that you get here on the console. So that's about infinite digest loop. One more point that I want to make quickly is some kind of meetup between the meeting between DOMinique and Mr. Performance. It turns out that if we have watch going over some attribute of the DOM, such as this one, where we watch the client height of the document body, we actually cause the browser to recalculate the layout of the page upon every digest iteration. This is what the terms that is used for that is forced layout. We force the browser to recalculate the layout of the entire page in this example on every digest cycle. And this is usually an expensive operation, especially if you have a lot of elements in your DOM. So you usually don't want to watch or do any other kind of communication in the DOM inside your scope watch functions or even inside your directives. Usually want to use either events that you can get from the browser whenever the window is resized, or you can also use a timer to poll it, because when you use a timer, you'll at least retain the control of how often it's executed. With watch function, it will be executed upon every digest cycle, which can be many times in a single second. So you definitely don't want to query the DOM inside your watches. I worked on optimizing one application which suffered from really bad performance because they had those watches all over the place. So every little action that, like in an Andrew repeat or something like that, caused a lot of those queries and a lot of forced layouts that cause the application to be really slow. So yeah, that's about DOMinique. So let's summarize. You want to keep the filters and functions that you use in watch expressions short and fast, especially fast. And you can use Batarang, as we have seen, to detect slow watches. You don't want to query the DOM upon each digest cycle, like we have just seen. And inside your watch function, like ng repeats or filters, you don't want to create new object or array each time, because that will cause infinite digest. So that's about Mr. Performance. Do you want to take questions before the next demo?
I think we can keep going on to the next demo.
Okay. Okay, so moving on to the next demo, that is Dr. Willem Scope. This is our scope expert, and you will teach us how to avoid scope inheritance traps and also make sure that your data always stays up to date. So, what are those scope inheritance traps? If we check out this code above, we'll see that it works. I mean, it's just a ng model with input, and then we display the value that the user inputted. But if we add some more code around it, like we add this div, and then we enclose the ng model with ngIf, it suddenly stops working. We have a demo for that, so let's just see that working in action. So the code for the demo is like what you have seen in the slides, 1-to-1. That's called the prototype trap. So let's see how it works or it doesn't. So in the first example, I type my name, and I can actually see it, and it works even on the bindings below, because they all share the same scope, so they are both bound to the same variables, so you actually see them in both places. But then if I open up the second editor, which is also bound to the same variable, let's refresh the page so you can see that. You can see that the second editor also updates as I type. And we change something here, like we type Jonathan's name, we can see that it stopped updating. And not only that it didn't update the text above and all those elements, it will also stop receive updates for them. So it's like the connection started to break once we, the binding connection started to break once we started editing the text in this input box. So why does this happen? Actually, it all has to do with the scope inheritance. So when we define this input, the second one, inside an ng-if, we actually create a new scope. And that new scope inherits from the enclosing scope that is also called the parent scope. So when we have this input above and it updates the username variable, it updates it on the enclosing scope, on the scope of the entire page, and then all of the other elements get to see that value, including the one inside the inner scope, inside the child scope, because in JavaScript, scope inheritance works this way. If we are looking for a variable, we first of all look in the current object, which in this case is the inner scope. And if we don't find this, the value for this in this scope, we'll go and look in the object we are inheriting with our. We'll go and look in our prototype object, which in this case is our enclosing scope, the parent scope. So whenever you change the username on the parent scope, you will be able to see those changes reflected even in the child scope. But once we enter some text into the input inside the child scope, the input sees that the ng model wants to put this variable, and it simply puts it always puts it in the current scope. So it will actually create a new variable called username in the inner scope and put that value in this new variable. So the child scope will no longer go to the parent scope to resolve the username when you read it, because it now has its own username member. Let's try to visualize this in Veteran. We go to the AngularJS, and then I think they have some bug that if you only have one scope, it like doesn't show it. Yeah, now it has two scopes, so we can see them. So we can see that we have the parent scope. If we check out the inspector, we can see that this is the parent scope, the entire page. And then there is also the child scope, which only covers this, second input box. So once I type my name above, I can see that the parent scope has updated, and we have my username in the parent scope. But then if I go, and the child scope is empty, but then if I go to this second edit and modify this, I can see that the parent scope still has the username set to Uri Shaked as in the first edit box, but then the child scope suddenly has its own username, and it has the value from the second input box. And then if I edit it above, it still updates the parent scope, but the child scope no longer sees that because it has its own username, so it kind of hides the one from the parent scope. So this one is pretty confusing to understand when you start wondering why your values stop updating suddenly. Fortunately, there is a simple rule that we can follow to keep this from happening. It's called the dot rule. The dot rule says you never create new objects inside the view. You pre-create those objects in your controllers, and you only modify properties of those objects. So in this case, you will probably want to create a user object in your controller, and this object will be created in the parent scope. And then you will just update the fields of this object. So even if you are inside a child scope, when you go to update the name property of the user, it will first look up for user, and since it won't find it in the child scope, it will look it up in the parent scope, and it will find it there, and then inside that user object that it found in the parent scope, it will update the name property. If you don't have the user in the parent scope, it will be created by ngModel, and then it will be created in the child scope. So that's why you want to create your objects in advance inside the controller. And you only want to access their properties, to update their properties, and not to update directly variables on the scope. So that's called the dot rule. It means that you always want to have a dot in your ngModel expressions, or even if you update something from an event handler like inside ngClick, you also want to do the same. So do this with a dot and updating an existing option, and don't do this just updating variables on the scope directly, because it will probably lead at some point to those scope inheritance issues, and we will just spend a few hours understanding why it doesn't work. There are actually plenty of Stack Overflow questions about this specific one. So don't waste your time on it. Just follow the dot rule and you will be fine. One other point about the scope is calling scope.apply. Angular does dirty checking, the digest cycle we just talked about, whenever it thinks it should do it. And that's usually following an input event or something like that that was handled by Angular. But in many cases, we integrate our code with third-party plugins, or we just write our own networking code or something like that for whatever reason. And then suddenly, our code stops updating. Let's see an example. I actually have here the final version with the solution, so let's remove it for a moment. Okay, so we have here a very simple view that shows value from the scope, and then the controller creates a timer that updates this value, increments this value every 100 milliseconds. And as you can see, we also use the dot word here. Instead of updating directly a variable on the scope, we just update a field on the user variable and create a user on our controller. So dot rule wise, we are good to go. So let's see this code in action. And as we can see, we expected the timer to update automatically because we increase the scope value every 100 milliseconds, but it doesn't work. However, if we change the value of the input, suddenly we can see that the timer has updated. What was happening here? When we type text into the text box, we actually fired an event which caused the ngModel to update the user.name on the scope, and then called the Angular's digest cycle, so Angular could update the view with the new name. And when Angular ran the digest cycle, it suddenly discovered that the value for timer on the scope has changed, and it updated the view with a new value as well. So if we update stuff on the scope from they usually call it outside Angular, from a callback function that is not called or managed directly by Angular, we have to wrap it in scope or root scope that apply call, which goes like this. We just wrap it with scope that apply, and it suddenly works. So by calling scope.apply, we actually tell Angular, evaluate, run this function, and then run a digest cycle. It also sets up error handling. So if this function throws an exception, Angular will handle this exception. But the most important role of the $apply function is calling a digest cycle. So whenever you have a callback that is called from the outside of Angular, just call scope.apply and wrap your function with this call, and this will make sure that your scope, that your views and all of the other stuff will be updated. You also need to do this when you call when you resolve promises. You need to call root scope.apply in order to make those promises call their success function. So whenever you see like something that should be updated but is not updated, and then when you perform another action on the page, it suddenly updates, it probably means that you just forgot to call scope.apply. So that's about scope.apply. In some cases, you are not sure whether you are supposed to call scope from .apply or not, because you're not sure whether you're running inside an AngularJS context. And if you call it when you're already inside the digest cycle, inside the scope, another scope.apply, you will get nasty error on the console. So there is a nice trick that always got covered. Use the $timeout service, just pass it a function. The function will be executed asynchronously and inside the scope.apply context. So if you are not sure, for example, you are passing a callback to some function, and this callback has to that function may call your callback synchronously or asynchronously. The best way is just to wrap the code inside the callback, inside the $timeout, and then you're good to go. So that's about Dr. William. Remember the dot rule, wrapping third-party callbacks with scope, apply, and or timeout, and never write directly to scope fields from the view or create new objects on the scope from your view, from your templates, because they will cause you the prototype trap that we have seen before. So last but not least is Messy Wendy. And there are some quick tips here. That's all. How to create better code. So first of all, if you don't like keep your code under control, it will get pretty quickly messy and hard to maintain. So some of the tools and their best practices that I use are, first of all, keeping my controllers short. I've seen cases where people have like 1,500 lines in their controllers, and I mean, you couldn't figure out what calls what, and it was like the entire application logic inside one controller. So there are several solutions for that. First of all, take advantage of services to move common or repeating functionality to group it inside a service. Then you can split bigger controllers into smaller ones. You can use UI router to create like sub-views of your current view, and each view can have its own controller. You can also use directives to encapsulate reusable components, and then you just move the controller logic for the specific component into the linking function or the controller function of the directive. And also remember the rule from DOMinique. Controller should never access the DOM directly. So any DOM manipulation go to the directive, not in the controller. Second tip is using JSint. JSint is a really nice tool. I will show you in a moment how to enable it in WebStorm, and it will just enforce some best practices and catch some of the errors before you make them. There was an Apple bug in a few months ago, and if they used like a tool to enforce good coding convention, the tool would have probably noticed that this third if statement is unreachable because they have double goto there, and would have saved them from this embarrassment of not validating secure SSL certificates. So definitely use JSint. It's really easy to enable it in WebStorm or your favorite IDE. In WebStorm, just go to the settings. I'm not sure if you can see the font here. Anyway, you'll go to JavaScript, Code Quality Tools, JSint, and you simply check the Enable checkbox. Then you can set up the options you want for your code. You can also use a JSON configuration file and share it across your developers. And then once I enable JSint, I can see that, for example, it's still working. If I reference variable, well, it's currently not working. We'll check that later. Anyway, if you forgot a semicolon or reference a variable that you have not defined, it will just tell you that. Then another tip is to prefix your directives and probably also services to distinguish them from third-party directives. So you can see that many open source projects also follow these conventions, such as UI Code Mirror, GMApp. And don't use the ng prefix because it's reserved for Angular directives such as ng-click, ng-show, ng-if. And finally, do test your code. So you can write unit tests that should be very simple and can also serve as documentation for the expected behavior of your code. And you can also use a tool called Protractor that is also provided by the Angular team to create end-to-end tests and to test your application end-to-end inside real web browser. So I think that one of the best reasons to write unit tests is that they force you to focus on write simpler and more structure-oriented code, because it's really hard to test like spaghetti code with a lot of callbacks and very many conditional statements. So it forces you to think how to refactor your code into smaller functions and simplify your logic as your implementation of the logic as much as possible. So summary of Messy Wendy: use JSint, write unit test, end-to-end test, just whatever you need to make sure that your code works before you deploy it to production, and do prefix your directives and also services probably. And don't put a lot of code inside your controllers and make them grow to monster sizes. Keep them small, clean, and purpose-oriented. So, before we take any other questions, keep loving Angular and don't forget to give back to the community answering questions on Stack Overflow, writing blog posts about it, creating open source for AngularJS. It's all about the community. So, Jonathan, do we want to take questions?
Yeah, we have Jason Pierce asking, what are good next steps to learning Angular for a beginner?
Yeah, I can see this on the chat. So, I actually haven't been a beginner for like a long time. When I started, I remember that they had a great tutorial on their webpage, which is a good starting point. It depends. Jason, in which level are you? I mean, have you created some Angular application? Have you already like figured out the basic, or you're just trying to figure out the basics? Don't know if Jason is okay. Yeah. So yeah, Jason haven't created anything with the Angular, and he has broken me. And he has some experience with Backbone.js. So I think that the first thing is to wrap your head about the roles of controllers, views, directives, and services to get a good understanding what should go where according to the Angular best practices. I think that either following a tutorial on YouTube or something like that, or some I think they still have this tutorial on the AngularJS website, and trying to figure out why they did the things the way they did it is a good way to start. You can also try looking in some AngularJS demos, like there is the To Do MVC, which is a good way to get something to start with. I would also recommend instead of like starting from scratch, trying to start from the Yeoman Angular generator. So you have like your entire development environment set up with all those. I think they still use Grunter, so with the grunt file and library load and all the other things, and then try to figure out how it works. Like first of all, it's some view and the controller and make them speak, and then add some routing logic, switch between different views. I will definitely try to get my hands on the UI router in a pretty early stage after just understanding how view and controllers like talk together. And then try to like use the grunt file or gulp file or whatever they provide to build the application, deploy it to a web server, and make it work. It usually doesn't work just like that out of the box. There are usually some issues you have to solve, and this will give you like a pretty good understanding of not only of how to build AngularJS apps, but also how to make them production ready. I hope that this answered the question. Any other questions?
Yeah, when you when you test Angular applications, do you unit test, just your Angular controller functions, or do you end-to-end test your apps with like a headless browser like Phantom.js, or what's your standard approach? And specifically, how do you detect performance errors? Do you test for performance, not errors, but performance bottlenecks? Or do you wait until like the app becomes slow in a certain area and then you dive deep and problem solve?
Okay, so first of all, I usually use a mixture of both unit tests and end-to-end tests. So the thing with end-to-end test is that you can get a pretty high coverage without much effort. Just testing a few basic flows of the application can get you a good mileage on code coverage. But then the advantages of using unit tests are that they are pretty quick to run. I mean, in one of my projects, I have like 500 unit tests, and they are like small tests. They run in no time. The entire test suite takes like 1.4 or 2 seconds. And they usually catch either errors that occurred from just even if I accidentally modify a file in the editor, they will just like delete a line accidentally. They will just catch it and make sure it won't get to production. And then, as I said before, the other two advantages of having unit tests are that they enforce you to focus on writing simpler code, and then they also serve as some form of documentation of what each function does, what it should do. The thing with end-to-end testing is that they are usually running really slow. I mean, in the same project, I have like 15 end-to-end tests that cover all the basic flows. And I also take screenshots during the test to see if there is some kind of CSS issue or something like that. And they take like 1 or 2 minutes to run. That's just for 15 tests. And if you had a bigger application with a few tens or hundreds of tests, they could even take 1 hour. So I know that there are some people who have like kind of different midway approach where they run the end-to-end test using their own framework inside the browser, and they have specific methods that the test cases, the test scenarios can call to interact with the page more easily. So instead of like going through protractor and WebDriver for each action on the browser, they just have the entire test case run inside the browser, and then just report the testing framework whether the test was run successfully or not. So this is usually much faster approach for end-to-end testing. I haven't experimented with it yet myself, but I definitely look forward to doing it once my end-to-end tests, the number of the end-to-end tests will start growing. So what was the second part of the question?
I think, like, do you specifically write tests for performance, or do you just wait until the app feels sluggish in an area and then dive and debug it?
Yeah, so I usually try to, with unit tests, I usually try to test the components as soon as I write them. Some people even take this into extreme and say write a test before the code is written. But in many cases, like when you are prototyping something, you don't know in advance how your code is going to behave. So in my opinion, it makes more sense to first figure out the logic for your code and then write the unit tests. I also don't unit test everything. I mean, there are things that are like getting 100% coverage is sometimes like really hard to do because you sometimes have to mock a lot of stuff just to get to a single line that you know that want to be executed in most scenarios, and you don't really care if it breaks, or you don't care so much if this specific line of code or this specific function breaks. But for most production code, I try to make sure it has good coverage in unit testing. And also, like tools like JSIN that I mentioned before really help to catch stupid errors like misspelling a variable name or something like that. Unfortunately, there is like no single kind of testing and that can catch all of the errors and problems. Unit testing is pretty good at either catching stupid mistakes, typos, like comparing a variable to the string false instead of the value false because you were distracted at the moment that you wrote the line. True story. And they usually don't don't catch it when things break because some component has changed its interface. So end-to-end tests are better in this. If you have like some kind of components that talk to each other, you probably want at least to test the public interface of each component, both in order to document it and to make sure that it doesn't break. Even and sometimes I even do that for third-party code. So if I have like a third-party library and I know there is some behavior of the library that I'm really dependent on and I don't want my code to break if it changes, I actually create a unit test to make sure that this behavior of the third-party library does not change. So I think to summarize, the purpose of end-to-end of unit testing is to catch like silly mistakes and prevent you from deploying to production. And also, as I said before, the documenting your code and helping you to structure it in a more modular and reusable way. And end-to-end testing is for testing like how everything integrates together. And then there is the component testing that I mentioned before that I don't currently do, but I definitely look forward to doing this. And I have yet to figure out which way works for me. And so I guess that's it.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you very much, Uri Shaked, for taking us through many of the pitfalls and performance tips and tricks with coding in Angular. You can book Uri on airpair.me/Urish, and he regularly speaks and presents Angular topics. This year he was at AirConf, at NGConf, and he's a Google GDE, so he's very active in the community. Yeah, if you can just unmute everyone quickly and give Uri a big clap. Great talk.
Thank you, guys.
Although,
so tomorrow the demos, and enjoy your Angular.